Living next to a location that has an urban legend behind it certainly has been interesting. It was just one of those stories that parents would tell their children to keep them in line. The very first time I heard of it, I was walking home from the park with my father, who gestured nonchalantly to the dark forest nearby. I, of course, had already been aware of the forest that buffeted our town. It was just a collection of nature to my eyes. At first glance, nothing about it seemed special in any way. My father pointed to the trees and asked me quietly if I knew the legend of those woods. I shook my head, but kept my eyes locked on the shadowy mesh of branches in the distance. He said that whoever goes into that forest never comes out again. I quickly dismissed his claim with a boisterous scoff. Even as a kid, I knew ghost stories like that weren't true. He nodded to me, almost to affirm his statement. He said that for many, many years, people sometimes wander into the forest, and they just disappear. Despite my disbelief, I kept my eyes fixed on the forest as it slowly faded on the horizon behind me. Throughout my youth, my father passively mentioned that monsters and other terrifying creatures inhabited the forest, that they will drag you away, and you won't be able to return. I always just assumed that they were stories used to scare and entertain me. Just scary bedtime stories. About halfway through high school, my friends Ryan and Mark were all walking home from school one day. Our path took us along the edge of those very woods. Both Mark and Ryan were playfully shoving each other until Mark pushed a little too hard, and Ryan fell quite close to one of the trees. I laughed at his expense, but my chuckles were quickly stifled as I watched him scurry back away from the tree as fast as he could. When he stood back up, I noticed that all the color in his face had drained. I asked him if he was all right, and for a moment he didn't respond. He just continued looking silently at the trees. When I prodded him again, he seemed to snap from his daze and brushed off my question. We all continued walking for a few more minutes before Mark had to split off to head to his house. It was now just me and Ryan, who still seemed somewhat pale. I patted him on the shoulder and asked him what was wrong. He seemed unsure of what I was asking, so I gestured back to the woods. He only gave a passing glance and said that it was the stories his grandparents used to tell him as a kid. He said that they were just ghost stories about those woods. I gave him a sideways look, vaguely remembering the stories my father had told me. I asked him if he truly believed in all that stuff, and in an effort to appear more tough, he denied his fear, but said that the stories had just stuck with him since he was little. I nodded to him, electing not to press any further. It wasn't long until he split from our path and I journeyed home alone. Since then, I hadn't really given much more thought to those woods or the stories behind them. They all seemed to fade in the back of my mind as the years slowly drifted by. Over time, I had finished my school life and had gotten a decent job in town. I was lucky enough to have gotten married shortly after graduation. During that time, there were a slew of subdivisions popping up throughout the town, in an effort to increase the population from the neighboring cities. I was able to purchase one of the newly constructed homes, and we promptly moved ourselves in. Barely 6 months upon moving into our new home, our small family grew by one. My wife Anna and I had a son whom we named Jason, after my father. I had never felt more pride and joy than the day my son came into this world. The location of our house was near the western edge of those woods that mostly encircled the town. However, after my son was born, I had all but forgotten about those stories. To me, they just seemed like trees, just an innocuous forest that gave the neighborhood some character. It wasn't until my son Jason was 10 years old when I finally recalled everything my father had told me. During his childhood, my son was the adventurous sort. He enjoyed spending his days playing out in the yard as opposed to staying inside. Free spirit was probably the best way to describe him. On the weekends, he'd beg my wife and I to take him out playing. He always wanted to run around playing any number of games or visiting the park. At first, my wife and I had no trouble keeping up with him. It was a nice respite from our day-to-day labors. However, as we all grew older, those outdoor activities became less and less frequent. While his desire to enjoy the outdoors never waned, my wife and I had slowly become consumed by our careers. This left us little time to spend with our son, and when we weren't working, we were far too exhausted to go outside. One day, when I was coming home from work in the mid-afternoon, I happened to glance over at the nearby tree line. For a brief moment, I thought I spotted Jason standing there with his bright red jacket on the cusp of the forest. I blinked my eyes momentarily and he was gone. I shook my head and pulled into my driveway, and then entered my house. The babysitter we had hired to watch Jason greeted me as I set my bag down. I asked her how Jason had been, and she said that he was an angel, that he had been taking a nap in his room for most of the day. I smiled and nodded before heading over to check on him. When I opened the door and turned on the light, my heart sank. His room was vacant, and his bedroom window had been opened. The sitter with a trembling voice told me she had just checked in on him, barely an hour ago. I barked at the babysitter to call my wife and tell her that our son had gone into the woods. I dashed out of the front door and sprinted down the street to the very spot I thought I had saw him enter. I pushed my way through the thick bramble. It felt almost as if the forest itself was trying to repel me, but I pressed my way in regardless. I called out Jason's name, and a mess of birds launched themselves from the nearby branches. After the birds left the vicinity, and the last few leaves fell to the ground, a deathly silence filled the area. I paused and tried to gather my surroundings. It was then that I realized just how dark it was in these woods. It was like all the light from the setting sun outside had all but vanished. The dark silhouettes of the trees seemed to stretch upwards endlessly. I called out for my son once more, but I heard no response. The feeling of worry was starting to swell within my chest, and I continued further into the forest. I could feel my heartbeat quicken in line with my pace. Before long, I was sprinting through the woods, and after nearly 10 minutes of running, I stopped. I had heard a noise off to my left, the sound of brush being disturbed and twigs cracking. I quickly ran over in the direction, calling out to Jason. My gait slowed to a walk as I drew closer. I spotted something in the dark, slightly moving on the ground near a tree. At first, I thought it was my son, and that he had possibly fallen over. As I walked up to it, however, I realized that wasn't the case at all. The subtle sounds of bones popping and cracking, as well as the sounds of flesh tearing, met my ears. I looked down at the mass below my feet, and watched as it began to change. An arm jutted out from the black mass and pressed into the muddied earth. It began to push and pull itself up from the ground. Its head formed from the mud and dirt around it. A rotting visage looked back at me. Its dirt-covered hair clung to its face and scalp like slime. With each passing second, more and more of its body began to emerge. It wasn't long until it was standing before me. Its body was covered in dried leaves and coarse dirt, and leaned against the tree nearby. With the low light, it was difficult to discern where the tree stopped and its body began. Then, with one swift movement, its head snapped to face me. Two eyes of ghostly white stared pointedly at me. Its jaw slacked open and exhaled a noxious breath. I nearly vomited when the foulness reached my nostrils. The breath forced me to stagger back a few feet. As I stumbled, I felt my back collide into something. My body froze, and a sense of fear began to pierce its way into me. Then, I felt a hand rest gently on my shoulder for a few seconds, before its nails began to dig into my collarbone. I reflexively yanked and ducked away, turning to face whatever it was behind me. It was another one of those things. It looked similar to the one I watched emerge from the ground, but it was much larger. It was then that I started to notice a lot of movement in the distance between the trees. Like there were hundreds of shifting silhouettes, all of them slowly moving in my direction. I couldn't quite process what I was seeing. Hundreds of grotesque creatures crawling out of the ground and all walking towards me. My mind was racing, trying desperately to come up with an explanation. Just then, I heard a piercing scream cut through the thick forest air. I turned and began running in that direction. As I dodged between branches and lunged over shrubs, I located the source of the scream. It was my son. He was curled up into a ball next to a large pine tree, screaming and crying his eyes out. I ran over to him, and for a moment he swung his arms to try and bat me away. I told him to look at me, and when he did, his face brightened up slightly. I picked him up in my arms and turned. My muscles tightened, and I felt my blood run cold. There was a wall of them now, all surrounding us. Their faces were mostly vacant expressions. However, I thought I detected a hint of longing. They looked as if they wanted us to join them, to remain here in this forest forever. One by one, they began to close the distance to us. Their alien movements unsettled me as I watched their disjointed limbs struggle to maintain their posture. Jason softly asked me what we were going to do, and I just returned a faint smile. As the circle around us started to grow smaller and smaller, I spotted the slightest of openings between a couple of the creatures. I told Jason to hold on and tuck himself into a ball. The moment he did, I charged through that slight gap with my shoulder and barreled our way through. The impact caused both of us to fall to the ground. I felt a withered hand grasp onto my leg, and I kicked relentlessly with my other. A few panic-filled seconds later, my leg came free and I rose to my feet. I grabbed Jason by the wrist, and we began to sprint away from those things. We ran until our legs threatened to give out on us, and after nearly 20 minutes of running, we both burst through a wall of brush, falling prone on the other side. Jason and I were both greeted by a few police officers as well as some paramedics. My wife screamed at the both of us with fear and elation. She ran over and hugged us both. The paramedics quickly came over and inspected us, and determined that our injuries weren't serious, just a few minor scrapes and bruises here and there. Anna asked us what had happened, and Jason was about to say something before he stopped and looked to me. I shook my head and said that I thought there might have been a wolf or something in the woods, but that I didn't get a good look at it. So we just ran out of there as fast as we could. She scolded both Jason and I for being so reckless, and we sheepishly agreed. As we all walked back home, Jason looked up to me and asked me why I didn't tell Mom what happened in the forest. I just smiled and told him that I didn't want to make Mom worry even more, despite knowing that she probably wouldn't believe us even if we tried. While he seemed unsure of my answer, he nodded and just quietly gripped my hand tightly. Before we reached our house, I turned back one last time and stared at those woods. A chilled breeze seemed to cut through my clothing, all the way to my bones. I thought back to all those stories that my father used to tell me long ago, and I now know that at least some of them were real.